and they post as Bob Smith, and they have a photograph, but really what they're doing is trying to talk shit about Joe Biden and get people to vote Republican in the midterms. Like, how do you know whether someone's real or not? Like, this is the big argument with Elon and Twitter, because Elon asked Twitter, like, what percentage of your website is filled with bots? And they say 5%. And he says, I don't believe you. I think it's higher. And let's find out how you've come to this conclusion.
Yeah.
And, I believe they said that they just took 100 random Twitter pages and looked at the interaction, and there's some sort of an algorithm they applied to it. But how do you discern?
Yeah, so I think estimating the overall prevalence is one thing, but I think that the question of looking at a page and is this page authentic, I think that there's a bunch of signals around that. One of the things that we try to do is for large pages, we try to make sure that we know who the admin of that page is. We don't necessarily, you should be able to run an anonymous page. You don't necessarily need to out yourself and say who you are running it, but we want to make sure that we sort of have like an identity for that person on file, so that way we know, like at least behind the scenes, that person is real. For certain political things, I think having a sense of what country they're originating from. I mean, some of that you can do just by looking at where their server traffic comes from, like is the IP address coming from Romania or
Romania.
Because if it's like an ad in some other country's election, then you probably want to make sure that that ad is especially in countries that have laws around that, are coming from someone who's a valid citizen or like at least in that place. So there's a bunch of, I think, I don't know, one theme in my worldview around this stuff, when it gets to some of the stuff that we talked about before, is like, I don't think that this stuff is black and white or that you're ever going to have like a perfect AI system. I think it's all trade-offs all the way down, right? And you could build a system and you can either be overly aggressive and capture a higher percent of the bad guys, but then also by accident take out some number of good guys, or you could be a little more lenient and say, okay, no, the cost of taking out any number of good guys is too high, so we're going to tolerate having, just a little bit more, more bad guys on the system. These are values questions, right? Around what do you value more, and those are super tricky questions. And part of what I've struggled with around this is I didn't get into this to basically judge those things. I got into this to design technology that helps people connect, right? It's like, and like,
but the consequence of the technology that you designed is that.
Of basically building this whole technology
deal with
roadmap
it
to basically give people this realistic sense of presence. It's like, that's what I'm here to do, right? So this whole thing that's like arbitrating what is okay and what is not, I obviously have to be involved in that because this is at some level, I run the company and I can't just abdicate that. But I also don't think that as a matter of governance, you want all of that decision making vested in one individual. So I think one of the things that our country and our government gets right is the separation of powers. So one of the things that I tried to create is we created this oversight board. It's an independent board that basically we appointed people whose kind of paramount value is free expression, but they also balance that with things like when is there going to be real harm to others in terms of safety or privacy or other human rights issues. And basically that board, people in our community can appeal cases to when they think that we got it wrong, and that board actually gets to make the final binding decision, not us. So in a way, I actually think that is a more legitimate form of governance than having just a team internally that makes these decisions, or maybe some of them go up to me, although I don't spend a ton of my time on this on a day-to-day basis. But like, I think it's generally good to have some kind of separation of powers where you're architecting the governance so that way you have different stakeholders and different people who can make these decisions, and it's not just like one private company that's making decisions even about what just happens on our platform.
How do you guys handle things when they're a big news item that's controversial? Like there was a lot of attention on Twitter during the election because of the Hunter Biden laptop story.
Yeah, we have that too.
Yeah, so you guys censored that as well?
So we took a different path than Twitter. I mean, basically, the background here is the FBI, I think, basically came to us, some folks on our team, and was like, hey, just so you know, like, you should be on high alert. We thought that there was a lot of Russian propaganda in the 2016 election. We have it on notice that basically there's about to be some kind of dump that's similar to that. So just be vigilant. So our protocol is different from Twitter's. What Twitter did is they said you can't share this at all. We didn't do that. What we do is we have, if something is reported to us as potentially misinformation, important misinformation, we also have this third-party fact-checking program because we don't want to be deciding what's true and false. And for I think it was 5 or 7 days when it was basically being
fact-checking,
being determined whether it was false. The distribution on Facebook was decreased, but people were still allowed to share it. So you could still share it, you could still consume it.
So when you say the distribution is decreased,
it got shared.
How does that work?
It basically, the ranking in newsfeed was a little bit less.
A little bit.
Fewer people saw it than would have otherwise. So it definitely.
By what percentage?
I don't know off the top of my head, but it's meaningful. But I mean, but basically,
Invisible.
a lot of people were still able to share it. We got a lot of complaints that was the case. Obviously this is a hyper political issue. So depending on what side of the political spectrum, you either think we didn't censor it enough or censored it way too much. But we weren't sort of as black and white about it as Twitter. We just kind of thought, hey, look, if the FBI, which I still view as a legitimate institution in this country, it's like very professional law enforcement, they come to us and tell us that we need to be on guard about something, then I want to take that seriously.
Did they specifically say you need to be on guard about that story?
No, I don't remember if it was that specifically, but it basically fit the pattern.
When something like that turns out to be real, is there regret for not having it evenly distributed and for throttling the distribution of that story?
What do you mean evenly distributed?
I mean, evenly in that it's not suppressed. It's not.
Yeah. I mean, it sucks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because it turned out after the fact, the fact checkers looked into it. No one was able to say it was false, right? So basically, it had this period where it was getting list distribution. So yeah, I mean, but I think like, I think it sucks though. I think in the same way that probably having to go through like a criminal trial but being proven innocent in the end sucks. Like, it still sucks to have like that you had to go through a criminal trial, but at the end you're free. So I don't know if the answer would have been don't do anything or don't have any process. I think the process was pretty reasonable. We still let people share it, but obviously you don't want situations like that.
But certainly much more reasonable than Twitter's stance, and it's probably also the case of armchair quarterbacking, right? Or at least Monday morning quarterbacking, I should say. Because in the moment, you had reason to believe, based on the FBI talking to you, that it wasn't real and that there was going to be some propaganda. So what do you do?
Yeah.
And then if you just let it get out there, and what if it changes the election and it turns out to be bullshit? That's a real problem. And I would imagine that those kind of decisions are the most difficult. The decisions of like what is allowed and what is not allowed.
Yeah. I mean, what would you do in that situation?
I don't know what I would do. I would have to like really thoroughly. Well, first of all, you're dealing with the New York Post, which is one of the oldest newspapers in the country. So I would say I would want to talk to someone from the New York Post, and I would say, how did you come up with this data? Like where are you getting the information from? How do you know whether or not this is correct? And then you have to make a decision because they might have got duped. It's hard because everybody wants to look at it after the fact. Now that we know that the laptop was real and then it was a legitimate story and there is potential corruption involved with him, what we think, oh, that should not have been restricted. That should not have been. There's like a really controversial issue where some people think that it's imperative that you take a very specific stance and you can't have the other stance. Mm-hmm. Like those moments on social media, those trouble a lot of people because they don't know why certain things get censored or certain things get promoted.
Yeah, I agree.
Transparency.
And it's like to be in your spot. And I was one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about is this, because like to be in your spot must be insanely difficult. To have, no matter what decision you make, you're going to have a giant chunk of people that are upset at you. And there might be a right way to handle it, but I don't know what the fuck the right way is.
Well, I think the right way is to establish principles for governance that try to be balanced and not have the decision making.
Oh, you need balanced principles.
Because I think that it's hard for people
the address where to find me.
Accept that like some team at Meta or that I personally am making all these decisions. And I think people should be skeptical about any so much concentration around that. So that's why a lot of the innovation that I've tried to push for in governance is around things like establishing this oversight board. So that way you have people who are luminaries around expression from all over the world, but also in the U.S. Folks like Michael McConnell, who's is a Stanford professor, who's like he was I forget which Republican president appointed him, but he was I think going to be considered for the Supreme Court at some point. He's a very very prominent and kind of celebrated free expression advocate, and he helped me set the thing up. And I think like setting up forms of governance around that are independent of us, that basically get the final say on a bunch of these decisions, and that's a step in the right direction. In the Hunter Biden case that you talked about before, I don't want our company to decide what's misinformation and what's not. So when we work with third parties and basically let different organizations do
what's
that.
The third parties?
Then you have the question of, are those organizations biased or not? And that's a very difficult question, but at least we're not the ones who are basically sitting here deciding. We're not the Ministry of Truth for the world that's deciding whether everything is true or not. So I'd say this is not a solved problem. Controversies aren't going away. I think that
They are.
It is interesting that the U.S.
take them away.
Is actually more polarized than most other countries. So I think sitting in the U.S., it's easy to extrapolate and say, hey, it probably feels this way around the whole world. And from the social science research that I've seen, that's not actually the case. There's a bunch of countries where social media is just as prominent, but polarization is either flat or has declined slightly. So there's something kind of different happening in the U.S. But for better or worse, it does seem like the next several years do seem like they're set up to be quite polarized. So I tend to agree with you. There are going to be a bunch of different decisions like this that come up. Because of the scale of what we do, almost every major world event has some angle that's like the Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp angle about how the services are used in it. So, yeah, I think just establishing as much as possible independent governance.
Define independent governance, please, Марк, дорогой мой друг, друг сердечных моих мечты всей жизни, лидер наших социальных историй, как еще правильно тебя описать. Такой архивный сайтик дорогого нашего Вирджила, и хотела бы я посмотреть побольше на видео.
Welcome everybody to a special version of the Wellbeing Culture Forum that we founded in March as an online debate discussion platform. We learned a lot from this virus, we learned a lot from this pandemic, and we learned that our cities are basically a monoculture of human life. Yeah, but we cannot live without the other life. We cannot live without the other biological organism that created our
projects about architecture, community engagement.
It goes away from this idea of the disposable.
This is something I want to gear towards Virgil, if from afar, is obviously the theatre pioneer Oskar Schlemmer, who really strived and created this new ethos for what is the idea of a new man in this kind of post-industrial era.
What is the idea of the
It's
new
this idea of
man?
animalism and restriction, order and chaos, man and machine. He said, I vacillate between two worlds, two styles, two attitudes towards life. If I could succeed in analyzing them, I think I could be able to shake off these doubts. Now, Virgil, who is very much a polymath, which inspired me when I was reading about Schlemmer, trained as an architect, now a designer, DJ, entrepreneur, engineer. Virgil, how
Everyone's a
important
DJ. You don't have to name yourself a DJ to be a
dualities
DJ.
and multifaceted identities in
Press
your practice
buttons.
and creativity?
Curate
When
music.
you look at the, maybe that didn't come through, but I think it's vital, that sort of freedom. You know, when we talk about the Bauhaus 100 years ago, it's almost as if you're putting humanity in this perfect box and hoping that it reacts to the experiment of the initial premise. And I think what a modern generation does today is, as Hans was saying, we have enough information to go back. You know, we have enough curiosity to find the epicenter and then find out what was left out of the history books or the logic. So, you know, this power of being free to float between disciplines, to be human, to contradict, you know, to have a premise and change the idea and readapt is what's great about our modern society. You know, we're in the midst of another civil rights movement. You know, we're in the midst of a global pandemic.
And his secretary, scholar at Cooper Hewitt. I've had the honor of organizing the Willie Smith Street Couture exhibition work too.
As we know, and as the world around us swirls around this idea of representing more people than just the people that participate, what you often get is a nomenclature that says, oh, you're breaking rules, you're having too much fun, you're not respecting the past, et cetera, et cetera. And you see in Willie's body of work how he's just free. You know, it's very similar to, you know, taking a kid to a restaurant or a movie or a gallery exhibit and telling them not to touch the art, you know, and it's like, you see that when you bring a new energy or sort of like an energy that can progress the system forward, the almost immediate reaction is to touch the art. And you could call that breaking the rules, but you could also call that sort of expressing oneself. So to me, you know, the context for this conversation is quite vital because we're talking about designer, we're talking about through the lens of Willie, but also talking about architecture. So there's a number of ways we can go.
There's one quote that I want to throw out there to what both of you are speaking, and it's by Peter McQuaid, who's a writer, and he writes in the book, it's a bit of a long quote, so you have to bear with me, but it's worth it. He was dating Willie at the time and was complaining about not making it professionally, and Willie told him, or he basically tells the story of saying, I listened as he explained that the reason his name was on the sign outside had nothing to do with some magical blend of ego and self-confidence, but because he found it impossible to do his best work in a rigid 7th Avenue environment. He knew because he had tried. In other words, there are those amongst us who will never fit in. It's not a question of wanting to or not wanting to, it's just not possible. If you are one of those people, you are going to have to figure out another way to do things because the normal way is not going to work. You have to work harder and probably fail some, but the rewards are greater. If you're older, you know what I'm saying is true. If you're younger, you're welcome. And meanwhile, I'll let you guys run off of that. I'll just share a couple of slides on Willie's work, but then also you guys collaborated recently and showing some of those the project that you also did together.
Yeah, James, in the era that you guys first connected, can you paint a picture of New York and the ecosystem that you guys were inputting ideas into?
Yeah, it was really that period when, you know, the whole art world was shifting. You know, it was kind of moving away from pop art and far more into performance art and environmental art. So Some of my best friends were over on the Bowery, which was the main, performance center. And I was in Soho, which is the main center of environmental artists. And there was a lot of dialogue going on, a lot of exchange of ideas. And it was just an amazing period because, in a sense, all of the artists after pop art were all trying to get out of the gallery. The whole idea was to flood into the streets. And we did it in a way very naively, and we did it with a lot of energy. But the idea was just to burst forth and get out. And, Bob Smith was always calling attention to the fact that you walk into a gallery and there's all those lights and all those pedestals and all those things. And you know exactly what to expect. And no matter anything, no matter how outrageous, as long as it was on a pedestal or in a frame or on a wall or in a gallery, you were already preconditioned to accept that. So the rebellious spirit of that time was just get out of the gallery altogether. A good friend of mine, Alice Aycock, is an amazing environmental artist that lives next door to me still, or before in Soho. We got in Soho now. But we always just kind of commiserate and say, oh, we should have just stuck with, 4 foot paintings, because all of the artists who continued in the more conventional frame of reference, became millionaires, and we were always struggling because we were always trying to figure out how to do it in the landscape or in the streets. So it was not an economically advantageous move, but it was, again, part of that rebellion. Can you get out of those constraints and do something else? If there's some other way you can do it.
Amazing. In regards to fashion making, like, was Willie one that was trying to sort of find a space within that community, or was he more bent on sort of bridging the community between art and fashion, et
Well,
cetera?
it could be true in a funny way. Was when he asked me to design spaces where the last thing I want to do is look like Ralph Lauren, and it's really true. He didn't want to be precious looking. He wanted to be, fun looking. He wanted to have something enjoyable, something different, whatever it was, and that was it. It was just the spirit of the times. It just couldn't be conventional. So he loved the streets, so we just dragged the streets into the showroom. And but he touched off a lot of things. I know in working for you recently, I mean, during a lot of that kind of criticism, dismissal, and there just isn't enough patience, I guess.
The civil rights movements to sort of ask for better representation, or understanding how we relate to the climate, and our relationship to the earth, et cetera. The only thing that can change is how we view something we viewed yesterday, with means of progressing, with means of having humanity click in some way, so that we sort of solve the world problems instead of perpetuate the rest. And I know that's a bit of a zoom out, be from fancy clothes in a window and buildings on the street. But James, what I love about your work, and what we can ramp back into Willie, is it related to everyday people, right? It didn't just relate to hollowed spaces. So James, can you tell the story about the show, the first, I think you and Willie first did a window display?
Oh yeah. Well, no, we didn't do it. Actually, we had done a window display for Rizzoli, which it was our window display. Yeah, there was architectural books, all architectural books. So we saw a big construction site right across the street on 57th Street. So we just went across the street and got all these bricks and mortar and all that kind of stuff. And we just distributed it with the window. So it's a whole construction site. The window was a construction site. In among the materials, of course, they placed the books, the new architectural book. Wow. I mean, this was done by Gianfranco Bonicelli, who was an incredible curator and visionary for Rizzoli. But, I mean, store designer just went apoplectic. I mean, they took it away in a very short time. But I think he's going to quit his job or something over this. But Willie passed by the store and saw this. And so that was our introduction. He called me up and said, yeah, I really love that window you did. Can you do something like that for me? So in a way, that's how it started. He
Window
really
displays are
liked
the
junk
key
world.
to the
And I did too,
future
because
of
as I say, it's where you
advertising
least
truth
expect to find art.
in this world
And
of
I love
constant
territories like that
change.
because they're open for exploration. If it's already, you know, a Gothic cathedral or a temple in Greece or something, I mean, Washington, D.C. is a big bore because it's all derivative and the iconography is not really relevant anymore. And it's boring. It's kind of copycat art. And I don't think there's any vitality in it. And because the art that lives on and forever and keeps it alive it was always controversial at the time of its inception. Always. I can't give anything that I really like that didn't have some controversy. And having lived in Italy, and look at Masaccio or Michelangelo. I mean, these guys were incredibly controversial for so many reasons during their own time. They're titans of the history. And, you know, I listened the other evening just bringing it up to date to a tribute. There was a film made on Jimi Hendrix, and I was a great fan of his. And I mean, it's incredible. I mean, when you play like that, you don't have to have any other rationale. And yet that was very controversial. I mean, he was dragged on and many years.
Were these studies that you were doing like on the street, like in the retail? Did this all predated? Were these your early investigations into what you would become the architecture, like more building projects before? Or were they happening concurrently?
Well, they were happening concurrently. I always like the process. I mean, the reason I like construction sites, I mean, the process is always more interesting than the finished product. And that's a hard thing to accept. If you're an architect, you know, you always kind of hate to finish it too much. Because if you over-finish it or you're over-articulate it, it loses something. It loses something. And I sure you feel the same way about fashion and products and things. I mean, there's something about a rawness or an edginess or a question being asked. It's always got to have something unanswered. You know, Duchamp said, I'm much more interested in the questions than the answers. And he's right. It's, you know, if it makes you, Duchamp, of course, is the pinnacle of that. It always makes you ask questions. And even to this day, you put some of his early work in a sculpture show today, and it's always the most interesting thing in the room. In fact, Giacometti and Duchamp are always the most interesting sculptors in the room, no matter who else is in the room. And, you know, and like Jimi Hendrix, I mean, so let's have involved.
Billy Smith, you know, this free-thinking American coming to fashion with a different set of circumstances. You know, he's diverse in like very distinct ways. His free thinking and innovation predates some of the canons that we thought were like the beginning, you know. But it's all in how we view that the beauty stories or the iconic heroic moments of an industry exist. And when you don't record those moments, and when Willie isn't embraced, maybe in a way, then all of a sudden it's left off to the side. No, and those are just stories to learn from. You know, what were you going to say?
No, you're absolutely right. It's very true. Because and another thing that's interesting, I mentioned Duchamp. What Duchamp did was took advantage of all those expectations of overhead lights and pedestals. But he used the pedestal like it was never used before. He used the frame like it was never used before. He always did. You put a urinal on a pedestal in an art gallery with conventional art, you blow the whole thing apart. You completely reassess where you are. And I think but that had been going on for an awful long time, so it was kind of hard to violate or radicalize or do anything in that environment. So the next thing was the street. The street had not been radicalized. And I think that we both appreciate that fact. I mean, you go to the street and you find, oh my God, here's heaven out here. There's all this stuff that's just waiting to be attacked.
Yeah, no, it's I look at it just very much the same. And to me, when you those stories, the same with David Hammond, you know, I see a complete radical perception shift when you can categorize a whole emotion in gestures that are, you know, a flag that turns red, black, American flag that turns red, black, and green, or, you know, telephone poles that become basketball hoops, or the Blizzard sale. I saw someone in the comment. You know, I think that in this year of 2020, when we're sort of searching for answers, we're almost like, you know, I think this conversation is perfect for a young generation who can unravel it and say the change that we want and the diversity that we want, you know, might be on what we're considering artists that are on the fringe, or, you know, or prodding at the canon in the unsafe way. You said it, Einstein was the best. I'm going to use that one. Like, theory of relativity probably was a pain in his side. He had to carry them.
And still, it's still valid. They're still working around it. I mean, it's beyond belief, the power of that simple idea. And it's this advice to young designers. It's called Tips on the Top. It's a new book that's coming out. And I mentioned Einstein in that. And here he was, like working as a patent clerk or something in Switzerland, when the whole country's about time. But what do they mean by time? They mean you're on time, you're not on time, you're late, you know, your time is up. Everybody could tell you what time meant, except that he asked a very simple question. What is time? Just one simple question.
What is that?
The most complex question of all time.
I don't love the design though, it's a little messy, but that's what we got. Spaceship Earth. For sure. It's so cold in Yugoslavia right now. Can you imagine, like, when time goes by and the internet becomes a completely different place, Virgil's website's gonna still looking the same? That thought is really warming my heart. Some things I just don't want to change. Like my love for fashion. I like this one. I would wear this at my wedding. Potentially. Angel.
those vast, and there's a litany of things to work on. The disciplines of art and culture have on how we will begin to live in the years to come. I challenge
unless
that
you die.
with the way that I've ordered the built environment.
Well, let's start.
Prepared. I prepared a lecture that's the latest state of art of my thinking and the logic that I operate from. It's the latest in the line of institutional engagements that are meant to inspire. It's meant to challenge the way that students think about their practice and how they can make their practice the future of the world. And it's only more so questions to think about, and me providing sort of insights from my career as these are things that have come up in my latest state of art, to share and to begin to see what relation the disciplines of art and culture have on how we will begin to live in the years to come. So I will share my screen to debut the lecture that I have prepared. So the name of this this event, I decided to title as No Discipline. And I think at the time, it's the year 2020, we're having this conversation amidst a global pandemic that the world has rarely seen in modern times. And I think it allows us a specific lens to view our existing world, and to view ourselves. And us as an arts community, an arts rooted community, which is now merged with tech, we have an opportunity to pause and analyze the systems that came before us, and also start to mold the future systems that we create. And I titled this No Discipline, as the intro supposes, that, you know, the necessary thinking of the past, that people needed to be experts in specific disciplines and sort of be separated from other disciplines. I challenge that with the way that I've organized my career, you know, and a lot of that stemmed from my education path. First engineering, civil engineering, structural engineering focus, and then I studied architecture under a curriculum as introduced, devised by Mies van der Rohe. But at the same time, it was the 90s in America, you know, hip hop, rock and roll, skateboarding. These things were merging to create a different pop culture for those ideas to sit in, and ultimately inspired me to be who I am today. And this sort of speaks to how you would look at the past informing the now, which is that each of these sort of like loaded genres sit separate. The idea is that it's easier to understand each when you look at it by itself, not informed by one another. So you would have art, you know, the media, which props up every discipline.
Right.
But how we communicate what happens is its own sort of important network. Architecture, which is the built environment around us, and even the unbuilt now in a digital sense. You have fashion, of course, and you have music. And of course, you could list out hundreds of other subcategories or categories onto themselves, but this is the sort of main structure and how we like to see things. You know, even our human eye, seeing them in a list is easy for us. You know, our rational mind can understand. How I liken that to today is sort of in this, you know, framework where
things are fragmented. Things are like off axis. Things are starting to integrate within
Cool.
one another.
Off-axis
And,
is the
you know,
thing.
ultimately, I believe this is the sort of, you know, dawn of the sort of internet renaissance, the internet age of information now doesn't flow in one direction or flow from specific institutions. You know, social media, the internet has allowed things to morph in a different way. And that's what this lecture ultimately is about, is systems of design, how they are morphing over time and what is now. Even further, I believe this is what we have, and this is what we're moving towards.
Oh yeah.
The idea that you won't be able to see the defined edge of each of those genres, that ultimately they will merge into a cloud, you know, figuratively and literally. This idea where
Good.
one thing is allowed to inform the other to the point that they're not descript. And I think it's important just to sort of visually see and visually and metaphorically understand that there is no rules in terms of how you understand this creative sect of our atmosphere and of our lives. It was a sort of man-made gesture to look at them in a way that was easy to understand. And these are the things that in my career I've been allowed to challenge and merge and operate within an atmosphere that's similar to this, rather than you know, the pre-described notion of how to keep each genre separate from the past. And this is a sort of rationale on understanding where are we at now, what art movement. You know, I think, of course, the classic model is understanding the past so you know where you were going. Today is an art movement. You know, we can say that for fact. You know, it just doesn't, it might not have its name that will be recognized 100 years from now, but we're inside of a lineage of man-made understanding which relates to art production, or a name for art production. You know, still with some sense of categorizing to understand what the view is in the moment. So how I rationalize that is, you know, the amazing period of the Renaissance, which was a cross-disciplinary moment in which different ideologies came together. And of course, as you can read, the Renaissance leading to neoclassicism, leading to romanticism, which brings us into modern art, contemporary art. And number 6 is what I'm proposing as this sort of undefined, but has the potential to be a new rationale. You know, a phrase that's used often that I often reject is the classification of streetwear, but more the definition I reject is the one that flattens it to a very simple, almost like non-logical rationale. And I think we're ultimately too close on the term to understand its full rationale. And for me, while I'm creating and while I'm in my career with extreme focus, my attempt is to produce some presentations and do some sort of rigorous analysis to put that term streetwear and methodology and adjacent to it, to have a deeper understanding about what this young generation that is today is trying to say, and ultimately what it's revealed. You know, I think that the internet is the tool that is the sort of crowbar or the shovel on reanalyzing the past, reanalyzing how we were delivered the past, who wrote the story, and analyze why. And if you compare that to the Renaissance, you know, that period of enlightenment, you know, our period of enlightenment allows us to draw new conclusions as well as forging ahead to the past.
So something like number 6, the streetwear methodology, has a bit of a rogue investigative tool, which is ultimately one of the best, being the internet, that you can control in the palm of your hand, to research, to find varying points of view. But as you'll see, that media, which is a super important category referring to the beginning, can take a left or right turn. It's peer to peer. It's informed by a number of voices, which we can ultimately decide is better or worse or in reverse. But worthy to note, as I demonstrate that the streetwear methodology is much more complex than a flat notion. It's a logic and it's a method of making as a product of access to information and resources influenced by the economy and socio-political atmosphere, ultimately influenced by a history of art. And you'll see how I've adopted that in my career and how I've used that to move through and investigate some thoughts of my own. This is the point where I like to refer to the notion that I just presented about the past. The past has its own author or its own sect of authors. And understanding the past has always been sort of glazed in this notion of foundation, almost of unquestionable fact, that the canons of art, the canons of fashion, the canons of music, the canons of architecture literally reside in Europe, or they reside in these sort of very stern, globally approved or presented as such facts. And I think the year 2020 is the perfect lens to reanalyze how the world has arrived in the place that it has. I'm speaking from an American point of view, which comes with its own sort of understanding to each region of the world. Our histories, our human histories dictate how we arrived to where we're at now. But I distill it to this idea of the canon, the canons within art, just being more specific, like saying, the great painters or the great sculptures or the great pieces of music, that those were inventions made by man that almost liken man to a supreme being, different from, but you could use the analogy of like great inventions in the theory of relativity, or great inventions in our location on Earth, to our location within the solar system, the sciences. But I think art has always attempted to mirror those vast achievements in man and create these canons. One of the canons of contemporary art that I deem as ultra important and of useful understanding pre the internet, obviously, is Marcel Duchamp. His contribution to contemporary art with his career, but most widely known, his investigation and submittal of the artwork titled The Fountain, which ultimately is a urinal, but through his rigor, through his rationale, and through his career, was able to prove that this urinal was the work of art that it is today. And it's by its rationale that it gains its strength. But I choose this canon for a specific reason. the predecessor to streetwear methodology that has now been removed from high art sense, white cube gallery for a selected few, but now has been informing the everyday producer that applies to people within the street or within the community of everyday people, not just the art community. So there's a valid reason as such. And me being an American artist of African descent, raised in America, but my family roots are from Ghana and West Africa. The combination of all puts me in a specific category within art that I refer to as the Black canon. So naturally so,
Metastatic canon, how about that?
same within, things
Ready
found
for
in
that?
nature. Diamonds, for instance, the pressure creates a new substance in a different context. So the experience that people of my nationality have felt in the sort of global ecosystem creates a whole lexicon of art movements, contemporary art movements, even to be specific, that are largely misunderstood or not understood by the traditional canon. And my work is inexplicitly, of the Black canon, to which largely my career is to define. And so, as the intro alluded to, my story within my career is ultimately to provide fidelity to my story. And I encourage that of every designer, of every descent. The world is more rich once we have an understanding of the things that haven't been recognized by the one author, by the one canon, and by the monolithic
Times
system.
we have
And
like a whole hour more to go through, but I can't continue with you at this time. But maybe someday you'll come to this beautiful treasury of website and see. Question I have for you is who's paying for the domain for the rest of the remainder of the internet, and what's the cultural preservation strategy around his work and his way of communications? Is there a cultural organization that helps us preserve some of the greatest minds of the creators that have contributed to the culture in a way that is so significant that Virgil did? Okay, that's a question I'm leaving you with.